maybe one of these times the character who's driving will actually keep their eyes on the road and not the person they're talking to. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2020 drama Wander Darkly, which will be released in select theaters and on VOD on December 11th. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all the extra content. Wander Darkly stars Sienna Miller, Diego Luna, and Beth Grant, and was directed by Miele. It tells the story of Adrian and Mateo, played by Sienna Miller and Diego Luna, as they revisit memories of their past following a traumatic event. It's not often that I go into a film with absolutely no expectations. I never read reviews before I watch a movie for the first time, and when it's an early screener for an indie film, I always avoid trailers and plot synopses too. But inevitably, I usually hear something about a movie, word of mouth from my festival-going friends and colleagues. Some sort of excited positive buzz, or even disappointment over a film they were sure they were gonna love. I don't usually get specifics from them, but I do inadvertently glean enough from them to have some sort of expectation. But despite premiering at Sundance this year, I hadn't heard anything about Wander Darkly. No buzz, no disappointment, nothing. So I wandered darkly into this viewing with absolutely no information or expectations, which made for an especially unique experience. This is a strange film. What appears to be a fairly traditional relationship drama at first glance soon transforms into something entirely unexpected. The structure of this film is definitely its most unique aspect, and it'll be the intriguing draw for some people and the frustrating deterrent for others. This is an extremely non-linear film. There's a defined beginning and end, but everything in between is a jumble of experiences, time periods, reality, and fantasy. But despite being a jumble with no obvious path, I thought it flowed remarkably well. It's pretty trippy, but not in a psychedelic way or anything. It's very difficult to describe, but it's kind of got this sort of ethereal high concept vibe that makes no sense and perfect sense at the same time. To be honest, I'm surprised I like the structure as much as I do. This is the sort of thing that would usually really frustrate me, because there isn't much explanation. What we see and what we think we see sort of evolve over the course of the film, and everything vacillates between this kind of dreamlike state and a seemingly more tangible one, so it's really hard to get a great grasp on it all. Very unusual things happen as the movie progresses, and the first few times it's really confusing, because the rules of this world, situation, whatever we want to call it, aren't clear. And to be fair, they're never really clarified, but I was able to just accept that and go with the flow of everything that was happening. It never made sense, but I never was confused to the point of frustration either. I always had an idea of what was going on, and it was just interesting to go along on this ever-transforming ride to try to solve the mystery. While the film's structure makes for an unpredictable experience, the story itself is surprisingly familiar feeling, and certainly hits the predictable story beats of a romantic drama. One of my least favorite things to watch in a movie is a couple arguing, and this film starts off a bit rough in that regard. But in spite of that, the way the story's told and the journey both we and the characters go on here makes for a surprisingly emotionally affecting movie. As I was watching, I was more captivated by the structure and transition effects than I was by the characters, so I kind of thought that I didn't really care about them, but then the final 10 minutes or so hit, and I realized just how invested I was in these characters and their relationship. It gets a tad sappy and overwrought by the end, but I was so caught up in the flow of this movie that I thought it really worked and had the emotional punch that it was intending. I think Wander Darkly is going to be one of those movies that a lot of people won't be able to connect with because of the structure. But it's also a film that wouldn't have been able to tell its story without that structure. I mean, it is about a relationship, and that aspect could have been covered in a more traditional way, but the story goes beyond just that. It touches on trauma and grief in ways that I haven't quite seen before, but it's also about memories and death and the idea of an afterlife, and it takes all of those concepts and applies them to a strained relationship. So it's this very ethereal examination and journey through this relationship, looking at what had been, what could have been, and what never was. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is the unique structure. this is going to be a point of contention for people. So you might be like me and think of this as the biggest pro, and you might watch this and think I'm absolutely nuts for not putting it at the top of the cons list. Usually I think this sort of intangible structure would have been a con for me, but for whatever reason, it really worked for me. It was just such an interesting way to present the story. It had this very good flow, despite its non-linearity, and it allowed for a much deeper examination of the film's themes by giving a reasonable outlet for the internal monologues of the characters, which you never see in movies other than as voiceover. The second pro was the emotion. This was something that really snuck up on me in this movie. I thought the emotion surrounding the relationship and the incident at the center of the story was pretty standard. I liked the performances here, but didn't really care about the characters all that much, or so I thought. It wasn't until the end, after seeing this unreliable telling of their story together, that I realized how invested in them I actually was. And so those final 10 minutes were surprisingly emotionally affecting for me. On the con side, my biggest issue was all of the argument scenes. Obviously, this is a really subjective thing, but I can't stand watching couples argue in movies. The performances were fine, and there was definitely a sense of believability to the fighting, but it's just not something that I want to watch. So this movie starts off pretty rough as a result, and there are definitely a lot of arguments and fights throughout, but luckily they don't swamp the whole story. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Wander Darkly or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Wander Darkly 3.5 out of 5 paws. Even though the relationship at the center of this film is nothing we haven't seen before, I really like the structure of the movie and the way it flows together with its themes. I would recommend Wander Darkly to people who like very non-linear, dreamy movies, at least in terms of the structure. This is a dark, pretty emotionally heavy story, centered around trauma and grief and the history of this relationship. If you need a movie to be very logical and informative with its telling of its story, this one's probably going to frustrate you a bit. But if you're able to just give into the flow and sort of accept the unpredictability of the premise, I think it could be pretty rewarding for you. If you liked Wander Darkly, I would recommend Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. This is probably the most obvious recommendation, and even though the story itself is quite different, the way it's told and how it plays around with memory is definitely a bit reminiscent. If you like the post-accident, out-of-body afterlife concept, you might want to watch If I Stay. It focuses on a teen romance and follows a slightly more traditional structure, but has some similar aspects regarding a character's journey through memories of their relationship. If you want another strange and affecting story about the afterlife, grief, and relationships, you might want to watch A Ghost Story. Again, elements of the plot are quite different, and the structure isn't as chaotic, but it does have a similar feel to it. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Wander Darkly? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that focuses on characters reminiscing about their relationship? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.